And
Well, the debt
God
deal,
willing, that would not be the
avoidance
case.
of partial default on maturing bond issues, was both praised and derided as fraud. I'm in the latter camp, as you would imagine. It did nothing to postpone the bickering about spending and revenue till the end of November. But it did change the rules by which future spending and revenue will be debated. Glenn Beck put it this way: Republicans and Democrats have just negotiated away the future of our children behind closed doors. Well, I'll take up that claim about the so-called super secret Congress that has been created by this later on. But in truth, the future of our children is already gone, has been gone for many years. This nation is already bankrupt, and neither the politicians nor the public have the will to do what's right, to rein in spending, war, waste, and fraud. But even though I believe the point of collapse is a lot further away than most, it is coming, and you can bet the powers that be will create some worse conflict before that time arrives to ensure that the ultimate blame for this fiasco gets swallowed up in the mayhem that they seek to be created and which they will claim was not their fault. Well, in reality, the details of the debate and the eternal bickering we will hear from now on are irrelevant to our future solvency, which is gone. It is important to know that the rules have been changed. There are no cuts so far. Only $25 billion in fiscal year 2012 and $35 billion in fiscal year 2013. Obama wants to defer most of the cuts to the latter part of the decade and leave room at the beginning of this process for more stimulus money. It's no wonder, that he knows that this is going to be needed given the state of the economy. And Bernie Bernanke is already talking about QE3. Well, even if you actually get $1 trillion in cuts over the next 10 years, that would only amount to $100 billion per year, which is a pittance relative to the size of the debt. And this is not, of course, a cut in actual spending. This is a reduction in the increase of spending over the next 10 years. Well, here's a review of the new way in which Congress will debate these issues in the near future. It won't be pretty, but it will be a pretty how messy a balanced budget amendment would be if it is riddled with all kinds of loopholes and sacred cows that ensure government can keep spending. Ruth Flower of the Friends Committee, that's the Quaker anti-war group, best analysis out there, Stan, put out this summary of what the changes will mean to the way the debt treatment is treated from now on, at least till 2013 when this expires. The bill would authorize the raising of the debt limit in two stages by an amount between $2.1 trillion and $2.4 trillion. Stage one is this: $900 billion in new debt will be authorized right now. As soon as the President certifies that the Treasury is within $1 billion of its limit after that, a debt ceiling increase of $400 additional billion is immediately authorized. Now, there's a lot of trickery here. Congress has 50 days to adopt a resolution of disapproval on that second $400 billion to overcome an anticipated presidential veto. Now, notice it takes a supermajority to stop all of this, but only a majority to pass it. Unless successfully disapproved, the remainder of the first $900 billion would be released. Now, if the debt ceiling increase is successfully disapproved by some miracle, the rest of the first $900 billion increase would not be authorized.
Hold that thought. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joe is simply pointing out that the gang of 12, or the coven, or 12, or 13, or whatever you want to call them, basically are going to determine how the cuts are to be made. And these are the cuts. Remember, we've agreed to come up with a dollar cut for every dollar increased spending. And what's wrong with that? $2.4 trillion increased spending, $2.4 trillion in cuts. But they don't tell you when the cuts are coming, where the cuts are going to be, and that'll be determined by the gang of 12, the coven of 12, call it what you will. And then, of course, the members of the legislature, House and Senate, cannot debate it, cannot amend it. They either accept it or they do not accept it, up or down. That's the only vote they can take. And of course, if they were to vote it down, There are automatic things that happen, and that is the most incredible part of this whole thing. You pick up this story, Joel, because this is the most incredible legislation I have ever seen in my lifetime.
But it is important because, frankly, it's not as bad as the hype has been put out. First of all, yes, they will operate in secret when they're negotiating about where to take these cuts or revenue increases. They don't have to get all of this 1.5 trillion or 3 trillion initially from just cuts. They can do a lot of accounting, juggling, as you know that they're doing, and they can do and recommend revenue increases. Now, even though those negotiations are in secret, it all comes out in the open on November 24th when they open it up, and it'll be made public what they're recommending, and every person in Congress has a yes or no vote. Now, what makes this a little bit dangerous is this is the easy fast-track system that always happens when you have a Congressional Reconciliation Committee. That is, whenever there's a bill passed by the House and the Senate, the congressional leaders appoint representatives from each house to meet in a reconciliation committee and bang out the differences. Now, what's dangerous about this, these were always yes men to the establishment. These are never opponents of the bill. And so you get things snuck in there. It's a lot of things happen. And then they come back out, and it's the same process. Majority rule, up or down, yes or no amendments, no filibuster. And so we've done nothing else, or what they've done is nothing else really than create a committee, just like a reconciliation committee, which has more powers, more dangerous powers, because these fast-track things are easier to get people to pass since you can't filibuster. But it is not, as some have complained, that all these rules and laws were made in secret. It is not that they can legislate things. And Alex Jones made a big deal of this, so did several others, that there was a comment by one of the Senate leaders or the House leader, I could forget which one, that says there are no limit to what they can consider. Now, what he was meaning was not that they can write legislation to create gun control or anything else, which is what people are claiming. It is only that they can consider everything in government for cuts or revenue increases. So it's a wide open slate within the confines of fulfilling the mandate of this, of meeting these 1.3 trillion in cuts. So I'm trying to put a little bit of a damper on this secret government thing, as if they can run roughshod forevermore. Everything that they do has to come out in the open, public, and has to have an up or down vote. And that isn't secret government. The powers that be, even though they conspire to take away liberty, are not stupid enough to do something that's going to raise the ire of the nation and make it look like a conspiracy. So I want to put a damper on these claims that this is, a grossly secret government. This is nothing more than what it is. That is a reconciliation committee that does things in secret but has to reveal what they've come up with and then a yes or no vote.
But, Joel, isn't it that if the people do not vote to go along with them, then, of course, certain things will automatically happen. In other words, there will be automatically massive cuts to the Defense Department and to Medicare.
Well, not massive cuts. Here's what the rule is, and this is why I'm going through this in this brief for tomorrow, is so that people can know. What happens in terms of the automatic triggers, or sequester is what the legal term. Sequester is like to hold hostage the money so that it can't go out above a certain level. So what the rules state is that an automatic freeze on government spending occurs and automatic cuts occur. Now, they are across-the-board cuts across all departments indiscriminately, with various exceptions for programs that are sacred to liberals. So I'm not in favor of across-the-board cuts, because obviously some things are less important in government than others. But because they cannot agree on what they should cut, except to salvage some sacred cows, I mean, the principle of automatic cuts is just like the debt limit itself. If the debt limit were held, which is what I wanted them to do, because it's better than a balanced budget amendment, the debt limit is an absolute limit. You just can't spend anymore. And once you're already filled up with spending, you just have to cut programs. And, of course, just like there is now with this automatic cuts that go into being, these across-the-board cuts, this is appropriate in the sense that it does make them stop spending so that they cannot go into debt above this stage 1 limit. If they don't agree on from what the committee comes up with. So what I'm saying is the only tricky thing about this is that there are so many sacred cows, and I list them. For example, let me just tell you what is off the limits that will not be subject to automatic cuts. There's the food program, which is used, the family support program, the needy families program, the supplemental security assistance program. A lot of people don't even know that all these programs exist. The commodity supplement food program, Medicaid child care, entitlement, refundable income tax credits, child nutrition programs, Indian tribal trust fund accounts, disability, black lung disability trust fund accounts. You ask yourself, now why are these trust fund accounts in this exempt category? It's because this is a tacit admission that there's no money in these trust funds. It's not that anyone's trying to take money out of them, it's just there's no money in it. And so the government has to put money into it, create money, just like the FDIC and the Social Security Fund. There's no fund in those. There's no money in those funds. So government has to allow enough money created out of taxable funds, to put in there. But all of these things are not going to be subject to the cuts. And so these are the things mostly that the liberals got in there to salvage the welfare benefit schemes. There are a few programs that are subject to the cuts, like Head Start, community service block grants, most housing assistance, nutritional assistance to women, infants, and children, and community health programs for the elderly. Now these are left in order. Well, I had to leave something, but you notice the list of what I mentioned was exempt is much bigger than the list of what's available for cuts. These are left, I believe, in order to create a hue and a cry of opposition when someone tries to do these cuts, which will push Congress inexorably towards more tax increases. And I think that's where we're headed, is more tax increases. Even there's an implicit tax agreement in this bill in that all the accounting assumptions assume that in 2013 the Bush tax cuts will, when they expire again, will not be renewed under this. And the government and this committee, I'm sure, will use the exigencies of the debt limit to say that we cannot renew these tax cuts. Now, stage one is likely to require, therefore, because all these other social programs are nearly exempt, require big cuts in the Department of Defense spending, because as a budget is simply the largest one in the security category, which includes, of course, international affairs budget, and that means foreign aid as well. Personally, I am in favor of cutting the defense a lot because I want them to stop these unconstitutional wars. And most of those wars, by the way, have been done on continuing resolutions rather than as part of the budget. And I don't see these continuing resolutions as part of that as well. This Department of Defense spending is generally, defense contracting spending. Really, there's a lot of money to cut there, even though the military is being worn out because of the fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if they would stop those things, we could recoup our defense spending with about a third. With about a third less defense money than we're presently spending. Now, stage two is much more of a mystery. The Gang of 12 will have just a few weeks to accomplish what Congress has been able to accomplish all these months. At the end of their process, if it fails, that is, if it's not approved by Congress, there is the threat of this sequester, which does not include any revenue enhancements except the non-renewal of the Bush tax cuts and fairly significant cuts in the Department of Defense, about $100 billion per year. But those cuts don't kick in for several more years, and we will surely have more wars before that time comes, which I believe will rouse public indignation that the defense doesn't have enough money, and they'll just simply bust the budget again. The Gang of 12, go ahead.
Now, don't you think, though, that one of the things they're going to do is go over the tax situation, and they won't necessarily raise the tax rates. They'll just take away all of the deductions there and get an extra trillion or trillion and a half out of the American people without raising the tax rates. Just take away all the deductions. This is certainly something they're considering, and they'll sneak that through, and then they can say, see, we're Republicans, we didn't raise your rates.
Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. As I said, they won't be able to sneak anything through. It will all come out on November 24th, and there will be a public, hearings about it, and everyone will beat their chest about it, and we'll see the same kind of arm twisting, I think, that we saw where most, I would say, 2/3 of the Tea Party elected Republicans succumbed to this and passed on this budget, what it was called, anyway, the BCA of 2011, this bill that just passed. Only 22 of our congressmen refused to pass this thing, and I think they deserve recognition. I know there was Jason Chavez of Utah was on that, Brown of Georgia, Duncan of South Carolina, there was Johnson of Illinois, Jordan of Ohio, King of Indiana, Mack of Florida, McClintock of California, Ron Paul, of course, Texas, and Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota.
Hold that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Chris Joel is simply talking about this idea of simply running up the debts and increasing the debts and simply not worrying about who's going to pay it. Spend the money now, get reelected, and then you retire with your comfortable pension as a congressman, and let somebody else worry about the fact that you've got this massive debt overhanging our nation. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, so the important thing to remember is that, and this is the unconstitutional part of this, the change that occurred in this bill, which Titus and Olson feel is unconstitutional. They're on our side of the political spectrum. In this new BCA, which is Budget Control Act of 2011, which was just passed and signed into law on August 2nd, Title III of the Act reads, debt ceiling and disapproval process. Under this title, Congress has transferred to the President the power to determine that the debt ceiling is too low, and that further borrowing is required to meet existing commitments, subject only to congressional disapproval. So for the first time in American history, the power to borrow money on the credit has been disconnected from the power to raise money, transferred to the President, and can only be vetoed by Congress. In other words, they have reversed now the entire process. And we think that there's going to be a legal challenge to that. Now, why is this important? Because ultimately, all debt-related borrowings have to be repaid with revenue collected in taxes. So when the process of borrowing is separated from Congress, which has the power to tax, as it has been a long time in practice, even before the BCA, because because of deficit spending. Deficit spending, where you just spend and then decide whether to borrow a tax later should never be allowed. You should basically have to have the money in the coffers before you can spend. Because when you go into deficit spending and people don't get a bill, as I said, they don't resist spending as they should. Americans grow up thinking that they can do all these foreign wars and deliver all these freebies to people without cost to them personally. I just love to see Americans get a bill for the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. It would be about $3,000 for every man, woman, and child in America every year. Do you think there'd be a hue and a cry to get us out of those wars if they got that bill? You bet they would. Now we are approaching the point where the credit of the USA is in question, as it becomes obvious to all that this much debt cannot and will not be repaid ever. But still there's no political will to stop it, especially from all the people who love government spending on their favorite welfare scheme. And it's not just the poor. We used to think that the benefit-corrupted majority would be made up of the poor and the people on benefits, the 30% to 40% of America that's on food stamps. But there's a lot of well-heeled, middle-class, and wealthy people that are in favor of these government benefit programs. Look at the supporters for Corporation for Public Broadcasting or the National Endowment for the Arts, or for all of these foreign aid things for Israel and things. These are not the poor. These are the wealthy people who are adamant we want to spend other people's money. We want to demand that everybody participate in supporting Israel. And it's the same mentality that conservatives get involved in with public schooling. They love the fact that we have all these expensive schools that their kids get to go to, quote, free, while those of us on the outside of the system, the homeschoolers and those that don't have children in school, are forced to pay. And that's the only reason they can go with low property taxes to pay, because it's being shared far beyond the users of the public schools. This is wrong. And, boy, if you tried to take away that, if you tried to say, we're going to put public schools on a pay-as-you-go basis, by a user fee basis by the users of public schools, and no one else will have to pay for them, you would see an uprising among conservatives, and it just shows how they don't understand the principles of proper taxation.
I agree with you, totally.
You know, there's this mentality in America, Stan, about cut spending but do it somewhere else. Don't touch my favorite entity. You know, it's akin to the tax mentality of, yeah, we need to raise taxes, but don't tax me. Tax only the rich. You know, we haven't heard enough that the rich, 3%, I believe, pay 80% of the taxes. Now, it's true that some people with specialized tax help can get away without paying much taxes relative to their total income. But still, they all pay more than we do, and it totals about 80% of the income of the United States from the three top percent.
Yes, but everything is really being done, or the majority of it is being done on borrowed money. And one of these days you're going to run into problems. You're not going to be able to borrow any more money. You know, you can't keep creating money out of nothing and borrowing from yourself, you know. One of these days, why, of course, even with all the bookkeeping capability they have, why the day of reckoning comes with other people saying, hey, I don't want American dollars because there's nothing behind them. And certainly they look at America, they see the moral breakdown, and all we would need be with one defect or one major loss of a war, people would begin losing confidence in the United States. We may be the mightiest military nation in the world, but certainly with one or two nuclear bombs on major cities, this whole artificial edifice could come tumbling down. And of course, it's because we've turned away from sound financial principles. And of course, we've turned away from the Lord as well. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is just talking about the fact that there are a lot of people out there who are saying, look, the solution is just to do away with the Fed. We'll get the government to print the money, and then, of course, we can pay off all the debts with the money that the Congress prints. Well, but what's behind the money? There wouldn't be anything behind the money. And so there's no easy solution or logical solution from that point of view. Simply by doing away with the Fed, as bad as the Fed is, we have to have a monetary system that is backed by something of permanent value. Well, before we get back to that subject, Joel, I want to tell our listeners how they can subscribe to World Affairs Brief and how they can get your books on security, on strategic relocation and the secure home and the other one. Go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. My World Affairs Brief comes out every Friday. It'll be coming out tomorrow morning, and there's a modest subscription. I think it's only $20 for the rest of the year. Everybody resubscribes at the end of the year. But people can, if they're considering subscribing, can get a free sample issue, especially what we're talking about, which is a little complex and people need to have in their archives. Email me for that at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. I was on Coast to Coast 2 nights ago, or last night I guess it was, and just had a tremendous reception talking about these things. People are really getting riled up with being taken advantage of by the government. Had a chance to talk about the new third edition of Strategic Relocation, and frankly, my office has been swamped all day with calls. It's just been my bestseller. The new third edition has all color photographs and maps about all the rated areas, all states and provinces of Canada and the United States. Has a completely new section on international retreats and detailed descriptions of how to do contingency planning and retreats, all of those things. It's really a great book to have. That Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. My largest book, the oldest book, is The Secure Home, 700 pages of everything about high security construction and remodeling, as well as complete self-sufficiency and how to implement that. The last book I have is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. It's an architectural plan book about how to do a safe room in a basement, complete with concealed entry. All of these books, you can find out about them on my website, and you can order them by calling Radio Liberty.
At 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-544-8927. And those books are among our very best sellers. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, the second point, as I alluded to before, there's no psychological limits upon this kind of money creation, even when it's done by ourselves. Everyone loves it because no one sees the tax bill, as we talked about, and thus there are few restraints either in Congress or among the public. for this kind of unlimited expansion of money supply. In fact, a lot of people have suggested you just do away with all taxes whatsoever, and the government simply prints what they need each year for taxes, and you just deal with a little bit of inflation. Well, there's only a reason why, as I was talking about stock certificates, why people got upset. When you start out with 30,000 certificates and you increase that to 100,000 certificates, you just taken the value out of what people have bought. So the government came in and required people when they wanted to add stock to the pool, that they do a stock split, meaning you're going to double the number of stock, and you have to give, or triple it, you have to give double the value, or twice as many shares to the existing shareholders, so that even though they've been diluted in value, they get twice as many of them so that they still retain their values. But we have no such mechanism. When the government prints more money, they don't give us more money to compensate for the inflation. In fact, they penalize it. They tax us on the increase in income that we get as prices rise and as salaries rise, even though there's no net increase to us. We get taxed on it. So what people need to understand is the reason they can still get away with a lot more inflation without it getting to hyperinflation is because the base of money in the dollar is so big. And the way it got that big was through the gold standard. We not only had gold-backed currency, we had gold-redeemable currency, which is the only true gold standard. And Nixon took us off of that in 1979 because everybody was seeing that the U.S. was inflating more than their gold and was deciding, hey, I'm going to cash these dollars in for the gold. France was just cashing in billions of dollars and taking the gold, and the U.S. was in danger of running out of gold, so they shut the gold window. That was a default. You know, we talk about this debt limit being a threat of a default. Well, the government has defaulted over 10 times since the beginning of the country. Largest ones have been the continental currency, the greenbacks, 1979, and there were some other ones in 1834 and various others in between. You know, with a base of $300 trillion, for example, they can print $3 trillion in currency every year, and it's only 1% of the money supply outstanding, so that doesn't show up as hyperinflation, and that's the real reason why most of the inflation is occurring overseas, because this extracurricular printing of currency that the Fed is doing is going overseas, and a lot of those people are dumping their dollars in the market by buying commodities. China's buying commodities, and they're using dollars. They're not using renminbi. They're trying to get rid of their dollars by purchasing them, knowing that they can't dump them on the money market because, in fact, the value of the dollar would plummet, and they would lose the value of the rest of the money that they have that they hadn't cashed in yet. I can't understand, Stan, how someone who claims to be a champion of free markets like Homo could not see the evil of Congress creating money out of nothing. How is this an improvement on the Federal Reserve? Well, it isn't, except for the fact that we're doing it rather than letting some secret cabal of conspiring individuals do it and get wealthy. Now, there is a misnomer running around the Internet, especially among conservative circles, that the reason that this is wrong is because the interest, you know, the Fed creates the money, and then they charge the Treasury interest on it. Well, frankly, that isn't technically, I mean, it is technically true, but the Fed is also required to give that interest back to the United States. Why do they even charge it then? It's because they treat those borrowings as actual bonds. They go through the motions of actually creating the bonds and trading them for the dollars that the Fed creates, and so it's more of a charade. But in fact, the Fed isn't getting all those billions in interest. That does go back to the Treasury. What they do get, though, they get the fees and other things associated, and they have hundreds and hundreds of brokers that are connected to them in Wall Street who get paid a percentage of all of these bonds that are created and go out through this monetary creation process.
Well,
So
Joe, maybe you could answer a question that I've often wondered, and that is, does the Fed pay a dividend to the people who own the stock, since their stock is owned by primarily by half a dozen major banks, and certainly by a few foreign banks? Do they give a dividend out of these Fed's profits that occurs compiled before they give the rest of the money back to the Treasury, or do we know whether they actually pay dividends on the stock of the people who really own the Fed?
We don't know because the workings and even the ownership list of who are the stockholders are been kept secret, and the Fed claims that it's none of your business. So that has been denied, and that was restricted. When the Congress agreed to Ron Paul's audit, they restricted it so that it only could deal with certain things. It would only be one time.
But we don't know. We don't know whether they're paying a dividend. In other words, a significant part of the interest to these, and I believe these are wicked and evil people.
We know that they're not paying interest received by the government as a dividend, because they have to account that the government knows how much interest goes from those bonds, and that gets returned to the U.S. Treasury. So the interest is not used for that.
All right.
Let's talk about one of the worst things, though, that's come out here, and I ran into this on my interview with Jeff Renz last night, is that Jeff Renz had just had Webster Tarpley on, and he was making the rounds of conservative talk shows. He'd just been on Alex Jones, and he was talking up the Tobin tax, only the Webster Tarpley version, which is even worse. The Tobin tax is named for Keynesian Nobel economist James Tobin. They always give Nobel Prize to Keynesians. And this is a proposed uniform tax on all currency transactions. Tarpley wants it to be set at 1%. Tobin was thinking about 0.5%. But Tarpley wants it to be expanded to include all Wall Street transactions as well, putting upwards of $3 quadrillion in transactions that would be exposed to this government tax. And he's just literally exclaiming joyously, we could pay off, in a week's worth of income, all of that. We'd have money to roll in. He claims it will solve all our debt problems and get the government once again rolling in money. Well, he makes it appear as if no one would be hurt by taking this small 1% or 0.5% from the wealthy speculators. Now, while I would agree that this would target all the wealthy insiders that are the main recipients of the Fed's funny money, they would find or carve out loopholes surely for themselves and leave the legitimate traders to suffer the tax. There are many things wrong with this tax, both in principle and in practice. First, this is not a principled free market solution, and it gives more money to government, which does not need an extra dime. It doesn't need to, and it doesn't need to have its time for natural consequences to come, down on this nation, lengthened by giving it more revenue. Here are the specific problems. First, the problem isn't the government doesn't have enough money. The problem is that the government is spending way more than the Constitution authorizes. It needs to be forced to spend less, not given trillions more in revenue. Remember that society's appetite for more benefits is insatiable. We've reached a point of high resistance to spending more, and we shouldn't be looking for solutions that release that restraint. And that's what's happening when they get rid of the debt limit and push it down the road. But fortunately, it's still coming back. It's going to come back in November, and it's going to come back in just after 2012. They've done that specifically so that it supposedly won't be an election issue, but I think it will be. Besides, as I told Jeff Renz, who was initially enthused by the prospects, in fact, I had a tough time even countering that enthusiasm. I told him the more money government has to use unconstitutionally in welfare and benefit schemes, the less chance we will ever have of regaining control over government, because we've got a huge benefit-corrupted majority now that supports all this spending. Number two, this is a devastation tax that would far exceed its 1% limit. And that 1% would be applied multiple times. That could lose you most of your money in less than 100 trades. I mean, here they think, it's just 1% of that transaction. But people don't realize that a transaction tax is done in total regard to whether or not you make a profit. It's not like the income tax where you total up your losses and your gains over the years in your trades, and you declare your income tax, and you only pay tax on what you gain. This is a tax on whether you lose money or not. Even if you lose money, you still pay the tax. Even if you make less than 1%, you still pay the tax, turning it into a loss. You get taxed both ways, Sam, buying and selling. Now, that's 2%, not 1%. If you make 5 trades in a day, that's 5% of what you've traded, because it takes out 1% every time you move the money. All these things create huge and perverse incentives against entering into the market. It would create instantly a huge underground black market of trading to evade the tax. And this is precisely what high sales taxes or a VAT tax does. You put a 23% tax on restaurants, and all of a sudden business starts to dry up. So do yacht sales, so do airplane sales, so do high-end car sales. And if you think that just affects the wealthy, just a whole bunch of people make those items that are then put out of work. Third, this transaction tax destroys privacy. Everyone would have to use a tax ID number to do any transaction in the market. You'd have to have registered paperwork. You'd have to be tracked electronically so that the tax penalty can be extracted electronically. What a great way to hand government the power to track every single financial dealing, especially if you included all Wall Street things. Is that what we really want? Number 4, it violates the basic principle of taxation. This is really a set of principles that I developed, but they really are standard and universal. This principle says that all taxes and user fees on economic activity must be restricted to the government services that support that economic activity. In other words, a port fee would be legitimate to cover the cost of the government's construction of the port and its inspection fees, but nothing else. You can't use taxes from economic activities like sales taxes to pay for welfare because they're not related. And what that principle also says, if you're going to be a benefit of welfare, you've got to pay the tax that pays for that, or someone else has to volunteer the revenue. You can't tax other people's economic activity for a government service that delivers benefits, and you can't tax it for something not related to where the tax is derived. Well, all of this is typical of Webster Tarpley, who comes from the Lyndon LaRouche crowd, which is the socialist crowd, with former Marxist associations. Lyndon LaRouche's wife is an open communist in Europe. These people, while often correcting their criticism of Jane Fonda and big government as the type of things they use to gain conservative support, offer only solutions that are socialist. After hearing Tarpley parlay his ideas on the Alex Jones show and Jeff Wren's shows, I got an email from a very irate subscriber who said, Tarpley, like LaRouche, uses his knowledge of history like a carny man to sell collectivism by constantly bashing those Tea Party idiots and greatly skewing the basic idea and principles of the free market, making it sound like anyone in favor of the free markets without empathy and caring for other people. I heard Tarpley said the other day with Alex Jones openly stating that his heroes were Roosevelt and Hamilton. And I've heard LaRouche say the same thing about Franklin Roosevelt. Two of the greatest promoters of government expansion ever. Tarpley is a strange duck, he writes, and I have to view all of them as wolves in sheep's clothing.
I think you're absolutely right. If you notice, I don't have Webster Tarpley on my program. I've analyzed LaRouche. I know exactly where he's coming from. He's a radical leftist dressed in conservative clothing, but certainly I share your concerns.
Well, LaRouche continues to reel in supporters with his Executive Intelligence Review, EIR. It's kind of a sort of an intelligence digest aimed at conservatives, which gets most of its intelligence from Russian sources. Conservatives have a love affair with everything coming out of Russia for some reason. I mean, it's like since they bought into the phony demise of the Soviet Union, which was a carefully crafted deception, now they think that Russia is free, and we get all this really good information because the former Russian spies have become free market people, and they know really what's going on in America. So we can trust everything that comes out of Russia Today, which is a TV program which is just getting a lot of play in conservative America. They interview conservatives, they promote conservative conspiracy theories, and so conservatives are thinking, wow, RT, it changed its name from Russia Today to RT just to downplay the association with Russia, and they have very good English speakers on there. But the son of a prominent Soviet dissident confirmed to me that every media outlet from Russia is controlled directly or indirectly by the FSB, which is the follow-on organization to the KGB, and they do it for disinformation purposes.
Well, Joel, I think that one of the big problems we have is an awful lot of people today just haven't been around as long as you and I have, and they're so easily taken in. And after all, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just have all that money and pay off our debts, and then the government could provide for everything for everybody, just like they do in Russia. And people have forgotten, actually, because at one time Lyndon LaRouche wanted to join his organization of the Communist Party here in the United States, and they wouldn't have anything to do with him because he was too radical for the American communists. We'll be right back here with Joel Skousen. This is covered in my book, AIDS, the Unnecessary Epidemic. If you haven't read it, you need to get it. Thanks so much, Joel.
Thank you, Sam.
Well, Well, this is Dr. Stan. I hope you appreciate Joel's remarks, and he certainly has an excellent overview of this. But of course, what happens is, if the Covenant of 12, the Covenant of 12, I'm going to call them that, if they come up with suggestions and Congress doesn't accept it, then they have automatic, of course, kick-ins. They have automatic responses, and what they involve is a large cut in the defense spending, a large cut in Medicare spending, and of course the congressmen are going to be afraid to vote for that because, after all, if they don't go along with the way this thing is set up, then they're going to be responsible for simply closing down much of our military, closing down the Medicare, and they'll be afraid. What they have done is simply Congress has abrogated its responsibility and given the power to the president and to the group of 12, the gang of 12. I call them the Covenant of 12. Well, you need to get the information. You need to understand what's going on. And so we do hope you'll continue listening to Radio Liberty. Well, we'll get to the news behind the news, the story behind the story. You need to understand, of course, what's really behind this whole movement. If you've never read my book on the AIDS, the unnecessary epidemic, I have a section in there on Lyndon LaRouche and his followers. He was so radical. He wanted to join his movement with the Communist Party USA, and they refused to do it because he was too radical even for the communists. And yet, of course, his followers are on the talk show circuits today, the conservative talk show circuits. And, of course, how convincing they are. Well, of course, you can get my book, AIDS, the Unnecessary Epidemic, and my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, by calling 1-800-544-8927. Now, I'll have to admit, when I wrote my book on AIDS, I did not understand that AIDS was about population control. I didn't understand that the government had created the AIDS virus. And how can we say that? Well, of course, we'll be documenting that for you from the talk we're going to be giving October 23rd here at in the Monterey Bay area, the annual Radio Liberty Conference. We hope you'll certainly mark that down, and you can call our 800 number, 1-800-544-8927, and tell people that you're coming to our conference. You certainly want to go ahead and get your hotel reservations. They are available. October is not that far away, and we usually get a great turnout. And so if you'd like to come to our conference, and of course you can hear the talk I'll be giving then about the covert population control agenda. We'll get into the background of the AIDS infection, but my book, AIDS, the Unnecessary Epidemic, is the best book ever written on the politics of AIDS. But of course, as I say, I really at that time didn't want to believe it was about population control. I didn't want to believe it was possible that anybody would create horrible new diseases designed to kill millions of people. But then I didn't understand the degree of evil we face today. So if you need to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, which addresses the evil organizations, you can get my talk on the Forbidden Secret, on the Dark Secret, and the syllabuses go with those DVDs, which you need to get and watch. Certainly you need to get the 4-tape set on the Bohemian Grove and the 4-tape set on Skull and Bones, and the books and DVDs that go with that. You need to get the 4-CD set, I believe it's a CD set on the Dark Awakening. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, there are literally millions of people out there like Ted Kaczynski who have been programmed by the government. You probably didn't know that Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was a victim of CIA mind control. There's a book written about that. We used to carry it. And in the final analysis, they got him in, they destroyed his faith in God and family and country, and they programmed him, and they turned him loose on society, and he became the Unabomber. Well, you want to hear about the Dark Awakening, too, a great 4-CD set on that, and then we ask you to pray for America, to pray for Radio Liberty, but please pray for Radio Liberty.